Good evening and welcome to the National Writers Series. I'm Jillian Manning, the Executive Director here at NWS, and I'm so pleased to welcome our guest author for tonight, Omar El Akkad. Omar's debut novel, American War, is an international bestseller and won or was nominated for over a dozen awards. But it's his gorgeous new work, What Strange Paradise, which we are here to talk about tonight, a novel that looks at the global refugee crisis through the eyes of a child. What Strange Paradise has been in the news these past few weeks, and for good reason. Omar is the recent recipient of the Scotiabank Giller Prize, an extremely prestigious Canadian literature award that has been bestowed on authors such as an NWS alum like Margaret Atwood. Our guest host tonight is Nargis Rahman, an award-winning Bangladeshi-American Muslim writer. She works as a reporter at WDET and is passionate about community journalism in the greater Detroit area. We look forward to spending the coming hour with you. Please join me in welcoming Omar El Akkad and Nargis Rahman.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Nargis, your guest host, and I will be speaking with Omar tonight. Omar is an award-winning author and journalist who's reported in Afghanistan, Gitmo. He's covered things like the Arab Spring and the Black Lives Matter in Ferguson. He's earned Canada's National Newspaper Award for Investigative Journalism, and his work has appeared in The Guardian, GQ, and many other newspapers and magazines. He's also the author of the book we're talking about tonight, What Strange Paradise. So first of all, I'd like to just talk about this book a little bit more with Omar. Welcome, Omar, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for doing this, Nargis. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the characters of this book, which really are the stars of this story?
Sure, yeah. So What Strange Paradise is a repurposed fable of sorts. It's the story of Peter Pan, reinterpreted as a story about a contemporary child refugee. The opening scene is of a shipwreck, a migrant shipwreck on the shores of an unnamed Western island. And the sole survivor is a 9-year-old boy named Amir. As Amir opens his eyes, he sees the authorities, these soldiers, security officials, sort of, who believe everyone is dead, but they see him and they come running towards him. He gets up, he starts running, runs through a nearby forest, and on the other side of the trees, sees the home where this 15-year-old girl named Vanna is doing chores out in the yard. They see each other. She decides in that instant to help him out because she can hear sort of these officers running. And from that point forward, the book alternates between before and after chapters. So the after chapters are what happens once the boy arrives on the island, and the before chapters are everything leading up to him arriving on the island. And it sort of goes back and forth and loops in on itself a couple of times. But the central relationship in the novel is between Amir and Vanna.
So tell us, what inspired you to write this book?
I mean, one of the fun things about making stuff up for a living is that after the fact, you get to sort of invent a very clean Genesis story. You know, this happened, then I wrote a book. In reality, of course, it's much messier than that, and there's all kinds of moving parts and sort of false starts and stuff. The closest thing I have to a Genesis moment, the one I always go back to, is 2012. I was still working as a journalist at the time, and I was in Egypt covering the aftermath of the Arab Spring. I was born in Egypt. My family's all Egyptian. And I was driving around with an old high school buddy who was complaining about the most universal thing in the world. He was complaining about rent. The rent's too high, the rent's too high. And at one point I asked him sort of, what's the rent for an apartment in your building? And he said, well, do you mean the locals' price or do you mean the Syrians' price? I said, well, what the hell's the Syrians' price? He said, well, we've had these people coming in and they don't have a choice. Like, you can charge them 3 times as much. What are they going to do? Go somewhere else? And just sort of the casualness of that cruelty, I think, was what got me started thinking about the things that thematically would end up congealing into this book. Over the years, as I started to try and put it together, there were these images that were sort of seared into my head. Of course, Alan Kurdi is the famous photo of the child on the shore. There's also a photo of a man and his daughter trying to cross into this country, having drowned in the river. And one of the things about these images, besides the sort of harrowing nature of them, is that they in the age of social media, they came wrapped up in these bubbles of outrage. How could we let this happen? How could we let this happen? But those bubbles of outrage lasted about 24 hours. And then we all moved on to the next thing to be outraged about, and so on and so forth. And what I wanted to do was the opposite of that. I wanted to dwell. And so I wanted to pick a particular fictional story and not look away for a while. I think a novel is a pretty good staging ground for that kind of thing.
Out of all the, conflicts that you've covered, you mentioned that you wanted to talk about the Syrian conflict because of that conversation you had with your buddy. But I wonder if there's other things that inspired you to talk about the Syrian conflict particularly.
Well, that conversation that happened with my friend, who, I'm not trying to throw him under the bus. I don't think he was sort of advocating that this kind of exploitation happened. To him, it was just the natural order of things. This is just, and it wasn't just apartments. It was down on the street when you go buy fruits and vegetables. They can hear from your accent. If I start speaking Arabic right now, every Arabic speaker in the world will know instantly that I'm Egyptian. The Egyptian accent is like South Boston or something. Like, right away. You're like, oh, Egyptian. So they would know right away and immediately be able to sort of apply that cruelty, because what's the consequences? None. But this was happening in the context of all the Arab leaders at the time talking about our Syrian brothers and sisters, our Syrian brothers and sisters. And it was all nonsense. The same way that for years you had the same people talking about our Palestinian brothers and sisters, and it was all talk. It was, on the ground level, it didn't matter in the slightest. And I think at that time, it just felt like a repeat of so many things that I had seen, not just in the Arab world, but particularly in the Arab world, because that's where I grew up. I spent the first 16 years of my life there. Of this notion of advocating for a particular kind of justice, a particular kind of compassion, knowing full well that on the ground level, none of this was happening at all. And that duplicity, I think, was one of the things that, I only write when I'm angry, and this got me pretty angry. So that was definitely a catalyst in writing this book.
Throughout the book, you talk about a lot of complex family dynamics. Some of them are, changing in the forms of what happens now and then after. Can you talk about why this was important to show in the book?
Yeah, a lot of what's happening in family dynamics is stuff that, I'm basically, I steal. That's what I do. I steal from all kinds of places. I steal from research, but I also steal from my own experiences. And a lot of these conversations that these family members are having, and even strangers are having, sort of on the boat chapters, which are most of the before chapters are basically this migrant ship crossing the Mediterranean. A lot of those conversations are sort of mashups of various conversations that I've been involved in or sort of overheard in my life. For example, there's one part early on in the novel where Amir, the central character, his family is forced to flee their home, and they end up in Damascus. They end up staying very temporarily at the home of a rich relative who is largely untouched by what is happening. Her wealth is enough to shelter her from it. And at one point, she's trying to explain to Amir's mother that all this stuff about bombing and about the destruction of cities is overblown. And this woman says, well, it happened to me. You can't tell me that it's overblown when I'm the one who experienced it. And the woman says, this very wealthy woman from the rich part of the city says, oh, no, that's all filmed on a soundstage in Qatar. None of that is real. Speaking to someone to whom this has happened, this is a real thing. This is a real conversation that I was witness to. And the sort of level, I guess the privilege of delusion, I think, is one of the things that was on my mind a lot when I was writing this book, because that's not unique to my part of the world. I now live in a country where there basically exist silos of belief. And if you want to believe that the COVID vaccine has microchips in it, there's an entire neighborhood for you now. There's an entire community. And so this idea of living within your own little silo of belief and having no real respect for what's actually happening is, I think, one of the privileges that a lot of these conversations are centered on.
Something that I really admire about this book is the imagery that you conjure. When I read through these chapters, I felt like I was in Damascus watching Amir going through these experiences, and then, looking out in the sea. Tell me how you used imagery to really tap into our emotions in this book.
I thank you, first of all. That's very generous of you. I think in scenes. I think very visually when I write, and so it is the laziest looking writing process in the world, because a lot of it is just me sitting on the couch doing absolutely nothing because I'm wandering through an old neighborhood or I'm constructing something or whatever. My wife, who has a real job, comes home from being a chemistry professor working on solar power, trying to save the world. And I have to explain to her that what I did today was mostly sit on the couch and stare off into space. It's a very, very asymmetric contribution to the world that we're both making here. I think almost exclusively visually when I first construct these scenes, and I try to hide as much of what I'm trying to say beneath the imagery. Shortly after that scene in Damascus, the Utus, the family, Amir Utu's family, they get on a ferry and they make it into Egypt, and they're going through the border crossing, and the Egyptian border guard looks through their passports with the forged visas, and he doesn't care about the forged visas. He's looking for a bribe. He's looking for like a few bucks stashed in there. And when he doesn't see it, he gets angry, and his first response is to accuse them of being Israeli spies, which he does by the way of saying you're all Jews or something like that, because there's a particular anti-Semitic streak in which that's pretty well interchangeable in the minds of someone who would be guarding a border crossing in Egypt. We had something like that happen to us. I remember driving through the desert with my cousins. I was visiting Egypt, and they're like, "We got to show you this beach. You're going to love this beach." It's the middle of the night. I don't know why we're going to the beach in the middle of the night, but this is the sort of stuff that happens in Egypt all the time. People get an idea at 2 a.m. and we're off. So we're driving. We're nowhere near a border. We come to a border crossing. They've just set it up in the middle of the highway for fun, I suppose. And we get there, and they tell us, "Where are you from?" Like, we're from here. It's like, no, you're from Israel. And at that point, that things are going to go really badly. And the first thing my cousin says is, not only am I Egyptian, but my father is a superior court judge. And immediately the border guard's face just drops. It's like, "I'm so sorry, sir, please go." Because in his head, the calculus is, maybe this guy's lying, but am I going to take the chance to find that? No way in hell, right? Those little sort of images of memory of those kinds of situations. I almost think that I write exclusively to get them down on paper. The residual sort of background imagery of whatever life I've lived. So a lot of that lives in the book, almost verbatim in a visual sense.
Another question I have is, a lot of the story takes place on the raft, the boat ride across the Mediterranean Sea. How do you imagine these conversations, and what kind of mindset were you in when you were thinking of what are people talking about when they're making this dangerous journey?
Yeah, it was a difficult thing to balance, and I don't know if I did it or not. It may well be that I completely failed in what I was trying to do, but what I was trying to do was balance the reality of something like that with the fundamentally fantastical nature of what I was trying to do. I was trying to write a fable. And so I've had this problem with both my novels, which is to say, with American War, I wasn't trying to write a literal prophecy of a second American Civil War. That wasn't on my mind at all. I wanted to take things that were happening to people who don't have much of a voice in this part of the world, and I wanted to recast them in the heart of the empire. I wanted to tell a different story and overlay it on America. And then the book comes out 4 months into the Trump administration, and immediately is read as a literal attempt at prophecy. It shows up on all these lists of like the first novels of the Trump era and the books you need to read. And that's been great for my royalty statement. But in terms of what I was trying to do versus how the book was read, there's a chasm between those two things. And something similar happened here in the sense that I was very much interested in writing something fantastical. I wanted to write a fable. I wanted to give it that feel of like a dreamlike journey. But at the same time, I didn't want to look away from the specific details of what happens on these journeys in real life. So there's things like, for example, in the book, you have these life jackets. The smugglers are selling the migrants life jackets, and they're full of foam. They're shot. If you fall in the water, they do the opposite of what a life jacket is supposed to do. That's not a detail I made up. That's a real thing. And so it was a balance of trying to get the kind of fabulistic feel of it with real conversations that I've seen people have about the nature of what it means to come to the West. In my mind, the book takes place at a collision of two fantasies. The one fantasy headed one way that says, all these people coming over here are barbarians at the gate. We need to keep them out at any cost. And then the fantasy headed in the other direction of, if I can just make it over there, everything will be good. And I wanted to collide those fantasies and have the story take place in the middle of them. And so one additional challenge on top of all of that is that the dialogue's happening in my head in Arabic, and then I'm translating it onto the page to English. And so it has this weird sort of jarring, people are calling each other brother a lot of the time, which in English usage sounds a little different than in Arabic when you say, Yahi, give me the thing, or whatever, like it's sort of, it flows within the sentence and it doesn't here. So the whole bunch of things on my little Jenga pile of trying to get it to work. And I don't know if I did or not, but that's what I was thinking about.
You talked about this concept of, if we just make it to the West, everything will get better. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
I mean, it's so when I was about 5, my father had to get out of Egypt. The political situation was bad and the economic situation was bad. And we ended up in Qatar, of all places, a little peninsula sticking out of Saudi Arabia. Qatar is 90% non-Qatari. It's just people who've come in from other parts of the world to cash in on the oil and gas money. And we were certainly among them. There's an entire spectrum of terminology on what constitutes a person who moves from one place to another. And at the most disrespectful end, you're sort of alien, illegal, refugee, migrant, economic migrant. And then if you're white and rich, you're an expat or something like that, right? Like it's sort of, we were kind of in no man's land in the middle. There was not really much of a name for us. But effectively, we're economic migrants. That's what we did. But Qatar had no local cultural industries. It's sort of, the background is a Bedouin culture. And the country itself is only about 80 years old or so. And so a lot of the culture was imported. And so we had Qatar 1 and Qatar 2. Those were our two TV stations. Qatar 1 was Arabic, Qatar 2 was English, and only had 2 programs from the West, MacGyver and America's Most Wanted. Why they picked those 2, I have no idea. And so I grew up on this stuff, right? And everything had to pass through the government censor. And so I still have my copies of like 2 Nirvana CDs, like Nevermind with the baby blacked out and In Utero with the angel blacked out. Everything was, I still remember holding up Newsweeks to the light to see what was behind the black ink to try and figure out what they didn't want us to know. But you get a certain interpretation of that faraway place when you grow up on its culture from a distance. And so I thought I understood the US. I thought, culturally I was American through and through. And then I moved to this country and realized that I don't know it in the slightest. And every morning I wake up and there's some new example of how I don't understand this place at all. And that gap between the sort of outward facing mythology of America and the inward facing reality of it is something that is completely obliterated by this notion that I've had, and many people I grew up with had since we can remember, of, yeah, but they leave you alone there. At least you get the hell out of here and there's no one censoring stuff before you read it or listen to it. And you can be left alone. In reality, there's lots of ways in which you are absolutely not left alone in this country, but just the promise of that obliterates any kind of subtle interpretation of this place, or at least it did in my mind. And I was trying to get at that a little bit about the reality of the place versus what you in your head need it to be.
That also reminds me that a lot of minority communities oftentimes come here to the land of opportunities and then have to financially provide for families back home. And so a lot of times relatives will think that, well, you're rich in America, aren't you? Everything is groovy, right? But it's sort of a thing that you can't explain until people, if they ever come across the sea and experience the hardships, the unique hardships that come. The other thing that you explore in the book is this fluid nature of how faith plays out into people's lives, but it's not overbearing. It's very subtle. It's kind of like something that is just really a part of people or not a part of people. And you talk about, you know, it's kind of almost a background noise. Can you talk about why you had it in that way?
I think that's sort of how it's played out in my life. Um, you know, um, a few years, well, not a few years, more than a decade after I came to Canada, I was working as a journalist, and I was I flew out to Afghanistan to cover the invasion, and on my way back, I stopped in Dubai. You fly in and out of Dubai. If you ever get a chance to go, they Dubai, like Terminal One, Terminal Two, like super swanky, Gucci, everything, whatever. And then Terminal Three is where they put all the flights to places that they don't want you to go to. And Terminal Three hasn't seen any development in like 30 years. It's a weird place. Dubai is a weird place generally, but anyway, I came back and it was during Ramadan, and it was the first time in more than a decade that I had been in a Muslim country during Ramadan. And I hadn't realized, like, Ramadan's been a part of my life for as far back as I can remember. And I hadn't realized how excruciatingly lonely it was to do this in the West. You know, suddenly I'm in a place where, like, the Baskin Robbins isn't opening until sundown, and then it's running till like 5 in the morning. And it's totally normal because everybody around you is, and it occurred to me that I spend a lot more time thinking about my religion living here than I did back home, where there's a mosque on every street corner. I'm not a particularly religious person, you know. I think maybe by Western standards I might be, by sort of back home standards, absolutely not. But just the act of not thinking about it, of just having it be part of the fabric, was such a, I felt like 30 pounds lighter, you know, just walking around in that context. And so in the course of the book, I wanted it to be that, you know, I think Muslim writers that I know, we constantly have this conversation about the spectrum of handholding. You know, on one end of the spectrum, it's like, I'm going to make sure you never get lost with any concept, right? So, inshallah, she said, me invoking the Muslim phrase for God willing, which means, but, and inshallah is in italics and so on and so forth. And I'm very much on the other end of the spectrum. I'm going to put it in there on my terms, and if it's not seen, it's not seen. I don't think either of those roads are right or wrong. It's just the one I've chosen to go down.
Dare I say, Google it.
That should just be the epigraph to like everybody. Just Google it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. That's really relatable. I want to explore, you know, why did you decide to do this story from a children's perspective?
I think I sort of gravitate to childhood. It doesn't mean I do it well. I think a lot of my readers will tell you that I do it quite badly, but I it's just magnetic for me. You know, I write about the things that make me angry, and those things are very rarely individual. They're systemic issues that make me angry. I'm much more interested in and outraged by systems that are fundamentally unjust. And one of the things all those systems have in common is that they're sort of predicated on lies. There's a kind of fundamental fraudulence to these things. And so, because I think of childhood as sort of the time of our only honest interaction with the world, I try to collide those two things: the sort of fundamental honesty of childhood versus the fundamental fraudulence of the systems I'm talking about. You know, it's a lot of what's in the book is little snippets of things that are from my childhood. So a lot of the conversation between Amir and Vanna, who don't speak each other's language, is based on stuff that I experienced growing up in Qatar, where you might be on the beach on a weekend or something, and there's another kid and you want to make friends, and you fundamentally assume that they don't speak your language, and so you're doing hand gestures and I'm 8 or what, like that sort of thing. So a lot of that worked its way into the book, and a lot of my own sort of childhood memories worked their way into the book. But yeah, I start there a lot of the time. And in the case of this book, I end there as well.
In terms of, writing books, what led you to write a book about war and conflict?
So before I wrote American War, which was my first published novel, I wrote three novels. There's probably a better way to say this, but they were not good. They were just badly written, not particularly necessary novels, and so I never showed them to anybody other than my best friend. They're never going to see the light of day. They're just going to sit on the hard drive, hopefully forever. But I was sort of working the muscles. I was trying to get in the kind of shape where I could write something that was publishable. I tend to. I was a journalist for 10 years, and I'd gone to all these places, right? And a lot of them, because I basically showed up in the early years of the War on Terror, and because I was one of literally 2 brown people at my newspaper, the other one being Kamal, the theater critic, who wasn't exactly being asked to go to Gitmo or I ended up covering these stories that were either sort of firmly in the context of conflict or very much conflict adjacent. I was covering war, I was covering terrorism, I was covering the military trials in Gitmo, so on and so forth. And I wasn't a good enough journalist to rid myself of those experiences exclusively through journalism. Journalism, by definition, you know this much better than I do, is about answers, right? If you don't have a who, what, where, when, how, you don't have a piece of journalism. I had a lot of questions. I had a lot of unanswered sort of residual experiences in my head, and fiction is where I go to sit with those. And so I ended up writing, American War is very overtly influenced by the things I saw in places like Afghanistan, when I was in Cairo after the Arab Spring, when I was in Gitmo. But this book too, sort of a lot of it is just the residual experiences of being in those places and leaving with questions that you're not going to be able to answer in any kind of non-fiction-y way, I guess. So I think that's why I gravitate towards those topics and when I'm making stuff up.
So my last question about your book is, without giving anything away, what is something that you want people to take away from this book and this story?
I used to have a much more certain answer to this. I used to be much more confident in my answer. With American War, I was like, this is going to change the world. The West is no longer going to bomb brown people after people read this book. It's going to, and then one of the first reviews back from a bookseller that I got for American War was from this bookseller in Texas who said, American War shows why a second civil war would be brutal and bloody and why it is necessary. And I thought, really? You thought I was advocating for a second civil war? Okay. So I learned very quick that what I intend, or what I hope the reader takes away, and what they actually do take away are 2 entirely different things. I think with everything I write, I want to slightly expand what the reader is willing to think of as fundamentally human and deserving of the basic prerequisites of humanity: love, safety, respect. I think of the act of writing a novel. I think of every novel as a eulogy for the person you were when you wrote it. The act of writing it transforms you into another human being. And if I can get a snippet of that, if the act of reading the book becomes in some way a eulogy for a snippet of the reader that has now changed, I'm happy. Beyond that, I've given up on any idea of Joe Biden's going to read this and immediately change immigration policy in America. I think that was easier to believe when I was younger.
Well, we're going to shift gears just a little bit. I want to dive into a little bit more about you. So you mentioned you were born in Egypt, you grew up there for several years, you moved to Qatar, then you went to Canada, and now you live in America. So How would you say that, experience of moving around and living in different countries, how has that impacted your world experiences?
And the short answer is in almost every way, every conceivable way. One of the stories that I go back to a lot is about when my father was trying to get out of Egypt. He got a job offer in Libya. And so we're sitting at the airport, and my father's name is Muhammad Ahmed Al Akkad. Muhammad Ahmed happens to be an incredibly common combination of names. So there was somebody on the terrorism watch list named Muhammad Ahmed. And so we get called into secondary. We miss the flight. They revoke the job offer. A little while later, he gets a job offer in Qatar. So I end up growing up in the country that would become pound for pound the richest place on earth, as opposed to growing up in Libya. And the entire trajectory of my life, the reason I sound the way I do, the reason I can write in this language, the reason I have the career I have, all of it was due to a coin flip at an airport that I had no say over. I was 4. And so it has really influenced my thinking about what constitutes achievement, the notion of manifest destiny, the notion of actualizing the future you want to have, and all of this stuff that in this part of the world is a huge cottage industry of like, create your vision board. And most of it is luck, and most of it is your choice of who your parents are and things like that. So that's hugely influenced my thinking as it relates to my writing, but also the rest of my life. The other part of it is that I don't have a good answer to that question of, where are you from? I was born in Egypt, grew up in Qatar, but I could never become a citizen of Qatar because they want to protect the oil wealth, so they don't hand out citizenship. It's almost impossible to get. I moved to Canada when I was 16. I now live in the US. I'm a citizen of both countries. And so all of my characters have that trait of being on really unstable ground in terms of not being able to look to a particular place or tradition or culture and say, this is mine. And so those are the two ways, just the power of luck in all of this and that sense of never being on stable ground.
Tell me what inspired you to pursue journalism as a career.
So fiction's always been my first home. I got a story in the school newsletter when I was like 6 years old, and that was it. I was hooked for life. But I come from a particular sort of social strata and cultural strata where you don't become like a writer or a painter. You become a lawyer or an engineer, or that sort of thing. And that very much fed into years later when I'm in Canada. I'm looking for a major, and I settle on computer science. Partially because it seemed to have a creative aspect to it, but still fulfill that whole, like, you're going to become white collar, middle management kind of thing. Also because I'd seen the movie Hackers, and I thought that's what it was like. I can tell you all right now, if you're looking for something to do with your life, computer science is nothing like Hackers. So I show up, and within a few weeks, I realized that this is not what I want to do with my life. And so I just stopped going to class. And one day I see an ad for in the student newspaper. They were looking for a news editor, and I show up, and they give me the job. And suddenly somebody was paying me, not very much, but was paying me to write this thing that I've always loved doing. I did it enough to the point where I was the editor of the student newspaper. By the time I graduated, I had a little portfolio, and it was the closest thing I had to an avenue of employability, because I couldn't program my way out of a paper bag. I hadn't gone to class at all. I don't deserve that computer science degree. I don't know why they gave it to me. But I could write, and I had a portfolio. And so I landed a job at the Globe and Mail, which is the national newspaper up in Canada. And for one reason or another, they kept me on after the internship. And I was there for 10 years. I got the education. I never got it at university because I got to see the world, and I got my writing fixed up by brilliant editors. I got to do what I love, or something adjacent to what I love. And towards the end, when I was good at, like, when I was invested, I was a really good journalist. When I wasn't invested, I was a horrible journalist. And towards the end, I wasn't invested anymore. They had me doing business reporting, and I didn't care about Apple earnings. So I ended up, when I sold American War, I thought, this is it. Like, if you don't jump off the cliff and hope that there's water now, like, you'll never do it. And so I did that, and I got very, very lucky.
It's really relatable. The thing about having a real job and then ending up in writing and hoping that someone will take you seriously. Um, I wonder what it's like, being on the other side of things. You were an observer in these wars and conflicts as a Muslim reporter, where a lot of these wars and conflicts right now, there's a lot of hypersensitivity to this war on terror, and 9/11 was pointing fingers at Muslims. So what was it like being on the other side as a reporter?
I get to relate one of my favorite stories about the war on terror. So they hired me on full time in the summer of 2006. I got hired on a Monday as a city reporter in Toronto. And on the Friday, we have the biggest terrorism arrests in Canadian history. And the Globe got beaten so badly on that story that it was these 18 kids, and some of them were kids, some of them were 17 years old, had all these grand plans of like blowing up Parliament Hill and beheading the prime minister, and none of it happened. They were being watched the whole time. So the RCMP, which is our FBI, swoops in on the Friday, arrests all of them. It's the biggest story in the world for about 2 weeks. It's the biggest story in Canada for about 2 years. And we got beaten so badly on that story. The Toronto Star, front page coverage, National Post, front page coverage. We had a brief on A2. We got beaten so badly, there's actually a story in the New York Times, you can look it up, about how badly the Globe and Mail was beaten, which is rare. Journalists don't usually do that to one another. Anyway, the following Monday, the editor-in-chief, who's obviously pissed off, has an all-hands-on-deck meeting. He's looking at the 300 employees in the building, and he's looking for anybody with experience in the Middle East, because that's where these kids' parents came from. With Islam, he's looking for brown people. A newsroom of 300, he finds the two of us, me and Kamal, who I told you about, theater critic, right? And he calls us over and he says, you're going to go to the mosques where these kids went. You're going to talk to people. You're going to do street reporting. Okay. So I go to one of the mosques. Kamal, the theater critic, goes to the other mosque. We come back. I'm writing my file. He gives me his file, and it's 500 of the most beautiful words I've ever read on the acoustics and the color of the velvet drapes, because he's a theater critic who just happens to be brown. Like, it's just, the next 2 years of my life was on that story. And it was such a fascinating experience of existing in neither world. I was being reminded every day that I wasn't fully a part of any one community. I remember we were sitting there and in the newsroom, and they published a story in which the reporter, this had been going on for about a week. The court cases were happening, and the wives of these men were showing up, and they were dressed in niqabs. And the writer kept referring to them as burqas over and over and over again. And I knew it was wrong, and I was too terrified to say anything, because I was a 20-something-year-old who was 2 weeks into the job. And finally, our Middle Eastern correspondent emailed the department saying, hey, those are two different things. You have to, but that was happening constantly. I would write a story, and then our star columnist, this woman named Christy Blatchford, the same day that I broke a pretty big piece of news about this terror cell, she wrote this piece about how we're ignoring the elephant in the room, which is that the people who commit these acts of terrorism, I remember this quote distinctly, always have first names like Muhammad, or middle names like Muhammad, or last names like Muhammad. I remember reading it and just thinking, like, the guy who sits 2 desks down from you, the reason you know anything about this, has a middle name like Muhammad. And just feeling fully sort of, again, unanchored from the world. You're kind of doing your job and you're trying to find a place for yourself. But those were years of just being in the wilderness culturally. And I think they influence everything I've written ever since. Those were two pretty defining years for me.
How would you say, 20 years now after 9/11, how have things changed for better or for worse in terms of how you can talk about these things, and how that has also showed up in your books as well?
I mean, something like this is happening and it's not a huge deal, right? Like, I remember at the beginning of all of this, you could almost see a person with a checklist being like, okay, here are the following identity groups that we need to, and as soon as we get one, we're good. We move on, kind of thing. So on one hand, there's an element of it's it's just constantly, it's exhausting to have this kind of Atlas syndrome where you feel like you have to carry the entire experience of whatever identity group you belong to on your back. So I'm going to write a story. It contains a Muslim character. They better be every kind of Muslim, because the Lord knows that this might be one of like 3 books that have that kind of character that are public, you know. And so you get into this situation where like it starts to create horrible writing, because your character is they have to be every version of this. Because if they're very devout Muslim, then what about the cultural Muslims? You've forgotten. And if they're culturally Muslim, what about the devout? And then also they have to be pure as the driven snow to offset all of the negative interpretations that you know, like systemically have been happening. You individually through your one character are going to offset all of that. It's nonsense, right? It doesn't make any sense. So a little bit of that feels less intense than it used to. It's not gone by any stretch of the imagination, but it feels less than it was. That said, you know, one of the really bizarre things about looking back at the last 20 years, which basically constitute the entirety of my adult lifetime, is how quickly all of that is being consigned to ancient history now. You know, I got called to do a TEDx type talk, this group that puts on talks that are similar to TED. And they were like, what do you feel like talking about? And I was like, well, I've been doing a lot of work on Gitmo. I have all of these photos. And they were like, yeah, that's great, but do you have anything more recent? And I thought, oh, okay, that's what we're doing now. Like, this is so long ago and so far away. And of course, the Trump years very much contributed to that, where everybody had like goldfish memory because the scandal today obliterates the yesterday scandal and so on and so forth. So I think that part of that is terrifying to me, because I feel like whatever we're really quick to forget about how we got to this place, where upwards of 1 million human beings are dead, and we will never have any accountability for that and for the illegal wars that caused it. I think every facet of that we sort of throw away down the memory hole is going to come back and be the instigator of the next 20-year nightmarish cycle that we go into. So that's the part that terrifies me, I think.
My last question I'll ask is, you know, you were recently awarded the 2021 Scotiabank Giller Prize for your book, What Strange Paradise, which is a very prestigious award. It's for the best Canadian novel, graphic novel, or short story collection published in English. What does this award mean to you?
I mean, it was life-changing. It was life-changing from when I got longlisted. You know, and I didn't think I had a chance in hell. So if you ever look up the acceptance speech, it's just this rambling. Well, I mean, all my answers tonight were rambling, but even by my standards, it was rambling and all over the place because I had no idea what the hell I was doing. You know, the jury is made up of writers whose work has meant a lot to me over the years. So that was a huge component of it. The other shortlisted and longlisted authors are people whose work I've loved for years. That was a huge part of it. Scotiabank has a lot of money, and they give a ton of money to the prize. So that was a lot of it. You know, they've bought me quite a bit of time of being able to write. But mostly I think it's sort of the default conversation that's going on in my mind at almost all times is one of insecurity. You know, when I was writing the first book, that voice was saying, what the hell are you doing? You don't have a book in you. You're wasting your time. When American War came out and wasn't a complete failure, it was like, okay, you're a one-hit wonder. You'll never do it. And to be able to sort of just say, quiet down to that voice has been a huge boon. But yeah, I didn't think I had a chance in hell. After you give your speech, they whisk you off through the kitchen of this hotel, this very swanky hotel, into the service elevator to take you up to the 17th floor where the media are waiting. And so I give my speech, they whisk me off, we get into the elevator, and the elevator breaks down. And so I spent the first 20 minutes of my life as a Giller Prize winner waiting for the fire department to show up, which is a very inglorious sort of, beginning to this. Finally, we clawed this thing open and I went outside. But yeah, it was surreal, and it's still surreal.
I saw that you dedicated your speech to your father, and I thought that was a very touching moment as well.
Yeah, I miss him quite a bit. He was the first person to tell me stories about writers, and it made writing feel like a thing I wanted to be a part of. And I wish he was around to see this, but yeah, that meant a lot.
Thank you so much. We're going to move into questions from the audience now. We have a question from Ken Winter, who says, congratulations on a well-written novel. Who was your intended audience and thesis when you see to write out your book?
Thank you very much, Ken. That's very generous. I have this sort of, I never have an individual. The closest individual I have is my friend Anna. This poor woman has agreed to read the first drafts of every novel I've written, including the 3 unpublishable ones. She's very kind and really shouldn't be doing this, but so sometimes she shows up as like, oh, Anna might like this, but mostly it's a rotating cast of people whose opinion means the world to me, people whose writing I admire, fictional people I've never met who I invent as possibly existing in the world. And one of the things I realized in the writing process is that I'm basically subjugating these people to whatever I want to write anyway. So it's not a matter of picking a sort of vector, picking a direction, this person. It's picking a person to fit whatever I was going to write in the first place. And so I'm constantly thinking, oh, this is a beautiful sentence. I bet if Garth Greenwell reads this, he'll really love it. And then move on, and something else entirely is happening a page later. And I think, oh, if this person reads this. So it's fully fraudulent way of thinking about it. But once the book goes out into the world, I've learned now that the first 4 people who read What Strange Paradise had 4 entirely different interpretations of what the hell was going on in this book. And so it was an early indicator that this thing was going to get out of my hands pretty quick. So I think of it now as like, the curling rock. You sort of you push the rock down the ice and you try to give it a certain kind of spin, and then it just goes wherever it's going, and you hope that it lands somewhere decent.
We have another question from Karen Siegel that says, you probably saw the New York Times story about the huge refugee puppet, Amal, searching for home. She travels from Turkey to England, encountering very different reactions, hostility in Greece, and sympathy from the Pope. What difference do you see in how different countries or different parts of the US think about and receive refugees?
Thank you very much for your question, Karen. Yeah, I was having really mixed thoughts about that, because on one hand, my naturally cynical nature was to think of it as purely performative and what are they doing? And then my naturally Machiavellian nature was, well, if this causes any kind of positive change in terms of policy or mindset, then I don't care what they do. Go with the puppet, do whatever, So those 2 things were kind of clashing. I think one of the things that has marked, both in Canada and the US, and of course the US to me feels like 10 different places all sort of mashed together. So I don't want to give a sort of sweeping generalization, but I'm going to give a sweeping generalization, which is this notion of whatever the actual pragmatic policy is, the quotas, the point system that they have up in Canada. I don't know if a similar thing exists here, but like, if you speak one of the official languages, you get this many points. If you're an engineer, you get this many points. That sort of what feels to me like I can see why they do it, but it feels kind of gross. Anyway, regardless of all of that, I think at a sort of narrative level, there's this sense of like, when we do something positive on refugee policy, it is an act of charity. It is an act of kindness. It is not some kind of obligation. And on the other side of that, the role of the refugee, once they show up here, is to be industrious and to be exceptional and to be eternally grateful. And I think even among the most progressive strings of thought in the mainstream of policymaking in this country and in Canada, some of that lives. You can sort of see that. And to be perfectly honest, I don't agree. I don't think that the parts of the world to which these people are fleeing are passive observers of the crises that caused the fleeing in the first place. I think this is true of the wars throughout the last half century that have caused this. And I think it's going to be particularly true of climate change migration, that's going to cause what I think is going to be the mass refugee exodus of the next few decades. And so I think of it as a matter of basic justice and restitution. And I don't see any obligation on the part of the refugee to be any more or less industrious or exceptional than the person who had the good fortune to be born here. That's not something that a lot of people would agree with, but that's generally where I stand on the idea of what a refugee policy should do and should be.
We have one more question for now. The last question is, in your acknowledgements, you mentioned other National Writers Series favorites like Emily St. John Mandel and Peter Heller. Could you speak about your relationships with them?
Yeah, so when I wrote American War, I had no publisher, no book deal, no expectation it would ever see the light of day. And once it did, this is all very inside baseball publishing industry stuff, so I apologize in advance. But like, one of the weirdest things about publishing a book is the blurb industrial complex, which is like writers blurbing each other. And half the time you think like, did you read this book? Did like what, and then it's like, X blurbs Y and then Y blurbs X a few years later, which has definitely happened to me in one case or another. I don't want to act like, I'm a huge hypocrite in this regard. I definitely have been involved in some of the, anyway, there is no good reason that either of these writers should have any idea who the hell I am. And a random editor at Knopf emailed them and said, hey, we have this debut writer. Can you read the book and say something nice about it? And Peter Heller said a nice thing about it. And Emily St. John Mandel not only said a nice thing about it, she wrote about it in the Millions, where she's a contributor. And she agreed to do an event with me. And Emily in particular, I'd read her work and I was a huge fan. And so it was one of the most nervous I was on that book tour, I think, was doing that event with her. But with a lot of these things, like writers who have achieved a certain level of success really don't have to do this at all. And a lot of them don't want to do it because you get 800 requests. There used to be a time if you went to Margaret Atwood's website, one of the main, like in big bold font, it just said like, I'm sorry, I can't look at your manuscript, because she was getting like this deluge of people saying like, please take a look at it. And they, when they get that, I can fully understand why they wouldn't do it. They did it for me. And so I was very, very grateful. This continues to this day. Like out of nowhere, a writer who you admire will agree to do an event with you or, do a panel or something. And it really is one of my favorite non-writing parts of writing. So you get to meet these people, and for every, I don't know what the ratio is. There's a lot of jerks, but there's also a lot of like really decent human beings, and those were two of them.
I want to leave off on the note of a question I ask a lot in interviews. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you really want people to know about you?
It's weird because like one of the first things that happened when I was an intern at the Globe and Mail, somebody, I forget who, one of the senior writers sat me down and was like, this is the question you ask at the end of every interview. You always, actually it was before the Globe, it was when I was an intern at the Edmonton Journal. And they told me there's two reasons you ask this. One, you might find out something interesting, and two, if they sue you later on, you can always say, if they claim that you tried to direct the interview in a particular direction to make them look bad, you can always point to that last question and say, no, I gave you the opportunity to speak about whatever you want. I promise not to sue. This has been a fantastic experience. Thank you so much for taking the time to do it. No, you want to do book recommendations? That would be a cool note to end on. I don't know what you've been reading these days, but I'm happy to start with a couple of book recommendations if you want to jump as well. Can we do that?
Sure. I think that people would love to hear what you're reading as an award-winning author.
You're kind. Okay, a couple of good ones from my part of the world. We've talked a lot about my part of the world today, which was really, really fun, and I rarely get to do that. So Midnight in Cairo which is a nonfiction book about the nightclub scene in Egypt in the 20s. Just a really cool, well-researched account of like this very, like, just cool sounding time and place. And you have all these like German saboteurs coming in, and the guy who directed Casablanca shows up in Egypt and is like, for my next project, I want to do a biopic about the Prophet Muhammad. Everybody, no, don't do that. That's a really bad idea. And so he's like, fine, I'll do this other movie. And he ends up doing Casablanca. So that's a very cool piece of nonfiction. And then there's an Egyptian writer named Rahman Abdulaziz who wrote a book called The Queue a few years ago, which is this Kafka-esque, like, horrible ministry in a fake place that is very obviously Egypt. And there's a big queue, there's a big lineup of people trying to get paperwork. And it's just about the absurdity of the fascist state. She wrote a new one called Here is a Body, which is very much based on the Rabaa massacre, where the Egyptian forces went in and slaughtered upwards of 1,000 people. Brilliant book, incredibly brave. State security is now after her. I don't know if she'll be able to live in Egypt much longer, but also worth your time. So those are the two that I would recommend.
And I will tell everyone what I've been reading, which is What Strange Paradise. So I encourage you to grab a copy. And also it's on audio, is it called Audible or audiobooks, whatever you prefer. So you can also listen to it if you're during your commute, if you'd like. But I want to thank Omar so much again for a great interview and getting a chance to learn more about you and your book.
Thank you so much, Nargis. I really, really appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. We really appreciate it. Have a good night.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We hope you'll all continue the conversation by purchasing a copy of What Strange Paradise from your favorite independent bookstore. Thank you again to our major supporters and donors: Cordia, West Shore Bank, the Northwest Michigan Arts and Culture Network, our literary sponsor, Oriana Community Co-op, Interlochen Public Radio, the Traverse City Record Eagle, and our presenting partner, the International Affairs Forum. This event is also made possible in part by the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. And thanks to you, our viewers. Your support makes all the difference, and the proceeds from our events go toward our Raising Writers programs to help share the love of reading and writing. Thank you, and good night.